What dark truths lurked behind the dazzling smiles of cinema's most beloved icons? While fans worshiped these gods and goddesses of the silver screen, shocking family secrets festered behind closed doors. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain on Hollywood's golden age to reveal the astonishing family skeletons that shaped your favorite stars. Charlie Chaplin. The lovable little tramp hid childhood trauma that would make even his saddest films seem cheerful by comparison. Before becoming cinema's first global superstar, young Charlie and his brother Sidney survived a Dickensian childhood after their mother Hannah was committed to Cane Hill Asylum when Charlie was just 14. Critics often wondered how Chaplin could so masterfully blend comedy with heartbreaking pathos. The answer lay in those formative years of absolute poverty and abandonment. After Hannah's institutionalization, Chaplin and his brother were sent to Lambeth Workhouse, a Victorian institution for London's destitute that left permanent psychological scars. The brothers were eventually separated, with Charlie shuttled between orphanages and temporary homes. These traumatic childhood separations fueled the abandonment themes running through classics like The Kid, where the tramp fights desperately to keep an orphan child. Studio publicity departments worked overtime to bury these unseemly origins, crafting wholesome narratives more befitting a Hollywood legend. Chaplin himself rarely spoke publicly about his mother's mental illness, though he financially supported her until her death in 1928. "My mother's insanity was the greatest tragedy of my life," he confided to close friend Douglas Fairbanks, "but it gave me an understanding of human suffering that I could never have learned otherwise." Joan Crawford. Before she became the immaculately poised queen of MGM, young Lucille Lesueur endured horrors that make Mommy Dearest look tame by comparison. Hollywood's premier glamour girl spent her childhood in crushing poverty with a mother who allegedly pushed her into sexual relationships with men for financial gain when she was barely a teenager. These traumatic early experiences shaped Crawford's notorious obsession with cleanliness and control. Former household staff reported that Crawford would scrub her hands until they bled and insisted on plastic covers for furniture, psychological responses to childhood trauma that followed her throughout life. Studio fixers at MGM worked overtime creating a sanitized backstory, claiming young Joan attended prestigious schools and came from reduced circumstances rather than abject poverty and exploitation. The brutal reality of Crawford's childhood helps explain her complex, often troubled relationships with her own adopted children. Director George Cukor, who worked with Crawford on multiple films, once remarked, "Joan built herself from nothing, and the fear of returning to nothing never left her." When Crawford's daughter Christina published Mommy Dearest, revealing Joan's abusive parenting, few industry insiders were surprised. The cycle of abuse had tragically continued. Crawford's famous line from Mildred Pierce takes on chilling new meaning knowing her history. "I've never lied to you, never cheated you, never turned you down when you needed me." Cary Grant. Hollywood's most charming leading man, known for his debonair sophistication, was secretly engaged in experimental psychedelic therapy to address profound childhood wounds. Beginning in 1958, Grant participated in over 100 supervised LSD therapy sessions, desperately trying to process the abandonment trauma that haunted him since childhood. The truth behind Grant's perfectly polished facade was devastating. At age 9, he returned from school to discover his mother had vanished. His alcoholic father told young Archie Leach, Grant's birth name, that his mother had gone on vacation. In reality, she had been committed to a mental institution. Grant didn't discover she was alive until he was 31, finding her still institutionalized in Bristol, England. A family secret that shattered his sense of reality. During his therapeutic LSD sessions, Grant confronted these childhood wounds, later stating, "I learned to accept that my mother didn't abandon me of her own free will." His therapist reported that Grant wept uncontrollably during sessions when processing his childhood. While publicity departments presented Grant as the epitome of sophisticated charm, behind closed doors he was desperately trying to heal. Director Leo McCarey once remarked, "Carey's lightheartedness on screen was his greatest performance. He was actually fighting demons most people couldn't imagine." This divided existence, the suave screen idol versus the traumatized child within, remained Hollywood's most carefully guarded contradiction. Judy Garland, the beloved star who brought Dorothy to life in The Wizard of Oz, was fed amphetamines and barbiturates by her own mother, long before MGM Studios continued the practice. Ethel Gum, a classic stage mother obsessed with pushing her daughter to stardom, began giving young Frances, Judy's birth name, pills to control her energy and weight when she was just 10 years old, creating the addiction that would eventually claim Garland's life. This parental betrayal established patterns that would define Garland's tragic existence. Studio executives and doctors simply continued what her mother had started, keeping the teenager on a strict regimen of uppers for filming and downers for sleeping. By age 15, Garland was already dependent on the substances that would haunt her for her entire life. MGM publicity departments portrayed Ethel as a devoted mother supporting her talented daughter, while the reality was far darker. Director Vincente Minnelli, who later married Garland, reportedly confronted Ethel about her daughter's addiction. "You're blaming me for something the studio doctors do to all the girls," she allegedly responded. When Garland gave birth to Liza Minnelli, she vowed to break the cycle, telling friends, "My mother gave me pills instead of love. I'll give my daughter all the love I never received." Despite these intentions, Garland's own addiction made stable parenting nearly impossible. Mickey Rooney, her frequent co-star, later revealed, "Judy never had a childhood. First her mother stole it, then the studio." Clark Gable, Hollywood's king, harbored a deadly secret that studio fixers buried so thoroughly that many film historians still debate whether it actually happened. In 1933, as Gable's star was rising, he allegedly struck and killed a pedestrian while driving under the influence. MGM's powerful publicity machine immediately went into overdrive, with studio chief Louis B. Mayer personally ensuring the incident would never reach the public. According to Hollywood Insider accounts, Gable was devastated by the accident, but was convinced by studio executives that revealing the truth would destroy his career and the livelihoods of hundreds of MGM employees. The victim was reportedly a middle-aged man whose family received a substantial financial settlement contingent on their silence. Police reports mysteriously disappeared, and witnesses suddenly changed their stories. This buried tragedy shaped Gable's notoriously reckless off-screen behavior, with the actor engaging in increasingly dangerous activities like flying combat missions during World War II. His close friend Carole Lombard reportedly confronted him about his self-destructive patterns before her own tragic death in a plane crash. "Clark carries guilt like other men carry wallets," director John Ford once observed. "It's always with him, weighing him down." When Gable filmed his famous, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn" scene in Gone with the Wind, co-star Vivien Lee later claimed his emotional detachment wasn't acting. It was the practiced emotional armor of a man harboring an unbearable secret. Marilyn Monroe, America's most iconic blonde bombshell, was nearly murdered in her crib by her mentally ill mother. Gladys Pearl Baker, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, attempted to smother young Norma Jean with a pillow during one of her psychotic episodes. This horrifying incident sent Marilyn into the foster care system that defined her unstable childhood. Bouncing between orphanages and 11 different foster homes, some where she endured abuse. Monroe's famous insecurities and desperate need for approval stemmed directly from this chaotic upbringing. She kept photographs of Clark Gable on her bedroom wall, pretending he was her father, a poignant attempt to create the family stability she never experienced. Studio publicity departments worked overtime to conceal Monroe's institutionalized mother and fragmented childhood, instead crafting narratives about her being an orphan, discovered by chance. The psychological trauma of her mother's attempted murder haunted Monroe throughout her life. During the filming of Some Like It Hot, director Billy Wilder found her sobbing uncontrollably in her dressing room after receiving a letter from the psychiatric institution where Gladys resided. "How can I be expected to become a whole person when my own mother wanted to destroy me before I even had a chance to live?" she asked her psychiatrist. This childhood trauma contributed to Monroe's lifelong struggles with mental health and her complicated relationship with her own maternal instincts, with the star suffering multiple miscarriages during her marriages. James Dean, the rebellious icon who defined youth culture in the 1950s, carried a dark childhood secret that fueled his trademark intensity and self-destructive tendencies. According to multiple biographers, a young James Dean was sexually abused by his local pastor in Fairmount, Indiana, after his mother's death left him emotionally vulnerable. This trauma created the wounded, angry persona that later made him a cultural phenomenon. When Dean was 9, his mother died of cancer, and his father, unable to care for him, sent him to live with his aunt and uncle. It was during this period of profound loss that the trusted religious leader allegedly began grooming and abusing Dean. The experience left deep psychological scars, creating Dean's paradoxical nature, desperately seeking connection while simultaneously pushing people away. Director Nicholas Ray, who worked with Dean on Rebel Without a Cause, later said, "Jimmy had rage inside him that went beyond acting. Something terrible happened to that boy." This insight into Dean's trauma helps explain his magnetic performance as troubled teenagers in both Rebel and East of Eden, roles where his personal pain became artistic catharsis. Dean's famous quote, "Dream as if you'll live forever, live as if you'll die today," takes on deeper meaning considering his childhood experiences and his fatalistic approach to life. Former girlfriend Ursula Andress once said, "James wasn't acting when he played troubled young men. He was showing you his soul." Rita Hayworth. Hollywood's most glamorous love goddess was sexually abused by her own father, who later exploited her professionally as a child performer. Beginning when she was just 12, Eduardo Cancino forced young Margarita to perform in border town casinos, dressed provocatively to appear older, and allegedly offered her sexual services to powerful men who could advance her career. This horrific exploitation created the profound dissociation that characterized Hayworth's entire career. "Men go to bed with Gilda, but wake up with me," she famously said, referring to her most iconic role, a statement that reveals her psychological separation from her sexualized public image. Studio publicity departments completely fabricated Hayworth's background, erasing her Mexican heritage and painting her father as a dedicated professional dance instructor rather than an exploitative abuser. The trauma of her childhood created Hayworth's lifelong pattern of disastrous relationships with controlling men, including her marriage to Orson Welles. Makeup artist Robert Schiffer, who worked with Hayworth for decades, noted that she would physically shake before performing sensual dance numbers, experiencing what would now be recognized as trauma responses. Director Charles Vider observed, "Rita danced like someone who was elsewhere in her mind." Columbia Pictures chief Harry Cohn, who maintained notorious control over Hayworth's career, allegedly knew about her childhood abuse, but used it as leverage to manipulate her, threatening to expose her shameful past if she refused certain roles. Bela Lugosi. The man who defined Dracula for generations lived in such desperate poverty that he was forced to sell his iconic screen-worn cape to pay hospital bills for his son's birth. While audiences assumed the star of Dracula lived in Gothic luxury, Lugosi was practically destitute by the mid-1940s, trapped in a morphine addiction, and unable to find meaningful work. Universal Studios had typecast Lugosi so thoroughly that when his son was born in 1938, he was reduced to pawning his famous cape for a fraction of its worth to cover medical expenses. This financial desperation led to increasingly demeaning roles, culminating in his work with notoriously terrible director Ed Wood. Studio publicity portrayed Lugosi as mysterious and wealthy, living in a mansion filled with bats and coffins, while the reality was a small apartment where he could barely afford rent. The cape, which would today be worth millions as a piece of Hollywood history, was sold for approximately $300 to cover the hospital bill. Lugosi's son, Bela Jr., later recalled, "My birth essentially cost my father his most prized possession." When Lugosi died in 1956, he was buried in a different Dracula cape donated by his family, a final indignity for the actor who couldn't afford to keep the authentic costume that made him famous. Director Roger Corman, who briefly worked with the aging Lugosi, noted, "The real horror in Bela's life wasn't Dracula, it was being forgotten by the very industry he helped build." Ingrid Bergman, the star of Casablanca, became so reviled for having a child out of wedlock that she was formally denounced on the U.S. Senate floor as Hollywood's apostle of degradation. When Bergman became pregnant by director Roberto Rossellini, while still married to her first husband, the scandal reached unprecedented levels for a 1950s film star. Senator Edwin Johnson of Colorado took the extraordinary step of introducing a formal denunciation into the congressional record, calling Bergman a powerful influence for evil and proposing legislation requiring films to indicate whether stars were decent human beings. The backlash was so severe that Bergman was effectively exiled from American films for 7 years, with theaters canceling showings of her movies and former fans sending thousands of condemning letters. The hypocrisy was staggering. Male stars routinely had extramarital affairs without consequence, but Bergman's career was nearly destroyed. Her daughter Isabella Rossellini later reflected, "My mother's greatest crime was refusing to lie about my birth." When Bergman finally returned to Hollywood to film Anastasia, director Anatoly Litvak observed, "Ingrid carries herself like someone who has been publicly stoned." The experience fundamentally changed Bergman's relationship with fame. After winning her second Oscar for Anastasia, she famously kept her acceptance speech to just 2 words: "Thank you." Journalist Ed Murrow, who helped rehabilitate her image, noted, "Hollywood forgave Ingrid not because attitudes changed, but because they needed her talent more than they needed to punish her." Boris Karloff, the man who terrified audiences as Frankenstein's monster, was born with a debilitating spinal condition that caused him excruciating, lifelong pain. William Henry Pratt, Karloff's birth name, entered the world with a severe spinal deformity that left him with one leg shorter than the other and a pronounced limp that he worked tirelessly to conceal throughout his career. This physical disability actually informed his iconic portrayal of the monster. Karloff drew from his own experience of physical suffering to create the creature's distinctive, lurching gait. The heavy monster costume, which weighed over 40 pounds, exacerbated his spinal condition, causing such intense pain during filming that he often needed to be carried off set. Yet publicity materials described Karloff as an athletic Englishman, completely concealing his disability. Between takes on Frankenstein, Karloff would collapse into a specially designed chair to relieve pressure on his spine. Makeup artist Jack Pierce, who created the monster's look, recalled, "Boris never complained, but I could see the agony in his eyes." Despite his condition, Karloff performed most of his own stunts, including carrying actress Mae Clarke up a windmill staircase, a scene that left him bedridden for 3 days afterward. Director James Whale once remarked, "Boris understands the monster because he knows what it means to live in a body that causes you pain." This personal connection to physical suffering imbued the monster with the humanity and pathos that made Karloff's interpretation so enduring. Humphrey Bogart, Hollywood's ultimate tough guy, carried a secret war wound that permanently damaged his face and created his trademark lisp. During his service in World War I, Bogart suffered a severe injury when shrapnel embedded in his lip and damaged a nerve, creating the distinctive speech pattern and partial facial paralysis that later became his cinematic signature. Bogart was transporting a military prisoner when their ship was attacked, resulting in the facial injury that would define his career. Rather than revealing the true nature of his wound, studio publicity departments concocted various stories, including tales about childhood accidents or boxing injuries. The reality of Bogart's war service and resulting disability remained largely hidden throughout his career. The injury caused Bogart constant pain and self-consciousness, particularly during romantic scenes. Lauren Bacall, his wife and co-star, later revealed that he used special numbing drops before kissing scenes to manage the discomfort. Director John Huston, who worked with Bogart on The Maltese Falcon and The African Queen, noted, "Bogey turned what could have been a career-ending injury into his trademark. That's his greatest performance." The war wound that studios concealed became the very feature audiences most associated with his tough guy persona. As Bogart himself once remarked to a young actor who was considering cosmetic surgery, "Kid, your flaws are what make you memorable. Without mine, I'd just be another pretty face forgotten by history." Mae West, Hollywood's original sex symbol, maintained a secret marriage to a man 5 years her junior when she was just 17, a union she concealed for decades. In 1911, teenage May married vaudeville performer Frank Wallace, then promptly abandoned him to pursue her entertainment career, denying the marriage existed even after Wallace produced the certificate in 1935. The revelation of West's teenage marriage threatened to destroy the carefully crafted image she had built as an independent, sexually liberated woman who answered to no man. Paramount executives panicked when Wallace resurfaced during the height of West's fame, fearing the scandal would damage her box office appeal. West initially denied ever knowing Wallace, then claimed the marriage had been a brief publicity stunt, before finally acknowledging the union and quietly arranging a divorce. This hidden chapter explains West's lifelong resistance to remarrying despite numerous relationships. As she famously quipped, "Marriage is a great institution, but I'm not ready for an institution yet." The experience of being trapped in an unwanted teenage marriage informed her boundary-pushing screenplays and infamous double entendres about female sexual autonomy. Director Lowell Sherman, who worked with West on She Done Him Wrong, once observed, "May writes about freedom because she knows what it means to be owned." The woman who boldly challenged sexual taboos on screen had experienced her own form of relationship constraint, fueling her revolutionary approach to women's liberation in her art. Bette Davis. The fierce, independent queen of Warner Brothers was shaped by her father Harlow's devastating abandonment, which left young Bette and her mother Ruth nearly destitute. This childhood trauma created both Davis's legendary determination and her notoriously difficult relationships with men throughout her life. When Harlow Davis walked out, Ruth was forced to become a photographer to support her daughters, struggling financially while Harlow started a new family he openly favored. Bette never forgot watching her mother scrape together pennies for food while her father lived comfortably across town. This early lesson in female self-reliance fueled Davis's unprecedented demands for quality roles and fair compensation in an industry dominated by men. Studio publicity departments completely rewrote Davis's background, creating fictional stories about a supportive father who encouraged her acting aspirations. The reality was far harsher. Bette didn't reconcile with her father until he was on his deathbed, and even then, the meeting was brief and unsatisfying. Director William Wyler, who worked with Davis on several films including Jezebel, once noted, "Bette fights so hard because she learned early that no one else would fight for her." This abandonment shaped Davis's approach to her own family life, with the actress struggling through 4 marriages and sometimes difficult relationships with her own children. "The men in my life may have changed," Davis once remarked, "but the pattern was set by the first man who taught me I wasn't worth staying for." Greta Garbo. Cinema's most mysterious recluse developed her famous aversion to publicity after being exploited as a teenage department store model. Before becoming Hollywood's enigmatic icon, 15-year-old Greta Gustafsson was reportedly coerced into posing for nude promotional photographs by her employer, a Swedish department store where she modeled hats. This exploitation created Garbo's pathological fear of cameras and publicity that defined her entire career. Studio executives were baffled by her refusal to attend premieres, give interviews, or participate in standard publicity activities. The truth, that cameras represented profound violation to the young woman from Stockholm, remained hidden from the public. MGM publicity departments invented romantic narratives about Garbo's reclusiveness, claiming she was preserving her mystery for career longevity. Director Clarence Brown, who worked with Garbo on multiple films, later revealed Greta wasn't being difficult. She was being traumatized every time a photographer approached her. Her famous line, "I want to be alone," wasn't a publicity stunt, but a genuine plea from someone who associated cameras with exploitation. When the nude photographs resurfaced in the 1970s, Garbo reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown, refusing to leave her apartment for months. Film historian Kevin Brownlow noted, "Garbo's entire persona, the downcast eyes, the reluctance to engage, the physical withdrawal, wasn't acting. It was the response of someone who had been profoundly violated and never recovered." Fred Astaire. Before Fred became Hollywood's most elegant dancer, he performed for decades with his sister Adele, whose battle with alcoholism eventually destroyed their partnership. While Fred went on to silver screen immortality with Ginger Rogers, his more talented sister spiraled into addiction and obscurity, a family tragedy that haunted him throughout his celebrated film career. Many critics actually considered Adele the more naturally gifted performer, with Fred serving as her reliable partner rather than the star. When alcohol began affecting her reliability, their vaudeville act suffered, eventually forcing their professional separation when Adele married British nobility and retired. Fred, devastated by the loss of his sister as his partner, initially struggled to establish a solo identity. RKO publicity departments completely erased Adele from Fred's professional narrative, creating the fiction that he had always been a solo performer discovered for films. The reality was far more complicated. Fred regularly sent portions of his earnings to support Adele through failed marriages and addiction treatments. Director Mark Sandrick, who worked with Astaire on several films, once observed, "Fred dances with such precision because he spent years compensating for a partner who became increasingly unpredictable." Despite achieving greater fame than his sister, Astaire kept a photograph of their final performance together in his dressing room throughout his career. When asked about his perfectionism, he simply stated, "I learned early that you can't rely on anyone else to get it right." Elizabeth Taylor. Hollywood's violet-eyed beauty grew up watching her father Francis brutally abuse her mother Sarah, creating the pattern of violent relationships that would define Taylor's own tumultuous romantic life. This family's secret remained buried beneath carefully crafted studio narratives about Taylor's idyllic childhood and loving parents. The abuse in the Taylor household was so severe that young Elizabeth developed a stutter from the trauma of witnessing her father's violence. MGM executives were aware of the situation but collaborated with the family to maintain their wholesome public image. This childhood experience created Taylor's complex relationship with male authority figures and her pattern of moving quickly from one marriage to another, constantly seeking protection and stability. Director George Stevens, who worked with Taylor on A Place in the Sun, once remarked, "Elizabeth has depths of emotion that come from somewhere very dark. She doesn't act pain, she remembers it." This insight helps explain Taylor's extraordinary performance in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Her close friend, Roddy McDowell, later revealed, "Elizabeth married so often because she was still running from her childhood home, looking for what her mother never found: safety." When Taylor became a vocal advocate against domestic violence in her later years, few understood it wasn't just celebrity activism. It was a personal mission born from hidden childhood trauma that shaped her entire life. Spencer Tracy, Hollywood's most respected dramatic actor, lived an elaborate double life, maintaining his Catholic marriage while simultaneously establishing a second family with a former actress. This arrangement required extraordinary compartmentalization and deception, with Tracy moving between his official residence with wife Louise and his unofficial home with Loretta. The situation became even more complex when Tracy began his famous relationship with Katharine Hepburn, effectively managing 3 separate domestic arrangements. MGM publicity departments worked overtime to maintain Tracy's image as a devoted family man, concealing both his second family and his relationship with Hepburn. Studio security personnel were regularly deployed to ensure Tracy's various partners never encountered each other at industry events. Tracy's alcoholism was directly connected to the stress of maintaining these multiple lives, with the actor often disappearing on days-long drinking binges when the pressure became too intense. Director George Cukor, who worked with both Tracy and Hepburn, once observed, "Spencer drinks not because he enjoys it, but because sobriety means facing what he's created." The Catholic guilt that prevented Tracy from divorcing his wife created a psychological prison that affected his health and contributed to his premature death. Actor Pat O'Brien, a longtime friend, later revealed, "Spencer was living 3 different lives. It's no wonder his heart gave out. It was being pulled in too many directions." Vivien Lee, the luminous star of Gone with the Wind, endured devastating mental health treatments that damaged her memory and cognitive abilities. Lee's bipolar disorder, undiagnosed until late in her life, was treated with primitive electroconvulsive therapy without anesthesia, traumatic procedures that her husband Laurence Olivier authorized in desperate attempts to stabilize her condition. Studio executives at MGM were aware of Lee's condition, but conspired to keep it hidden, fearing the stigma would destroy her career. During filming of A Streetcar Named Desire, Lee was experiencing manic episodes that director Elia Kazan incorporated into her performance as Blanche Dubois, a case of real mental illness being exploited for artistic authenticity. After particularly severe episodes, Lee would undergo electroshock treatments that left her disoriented and unable to remember lines. Olivier later wrote heartbreakingly about watching the treatments. The air would be rent by a piercing primal scream, and Vivien would fall unconscious. I would take her home, where she would not know who I was for several hours. These primitive treatments cause permanent memory damage, with Lee often unable to recall entire productions she had appeared in. Her dresser on Ship of Fools recalled finding Lee crying because she couldn't remember her lines. She kept saying, "They've taken parts of my brain." It was devastating to watch such a brilliant mind deteriorate. The woman who brilliantly portrayed Scarlett O'Hara was fighting a much more difficult battle off-screen, one that ultimately claimed both her marriage and her career. Marlene Dietrich. Hollywood's most sophisticated European import harbored a scandalous secret about her only child's conception. According to multiple biographers, Dietrich's daughter Maria was actually conceived during a planned threesome involving Marlene, her husband Rudolf Sieber, and Dietrich's lover at the time, creating lifelong paternity questions that were never publicly acknowledged. This arrangement typified Dietrich's revolutionary approach to sexuality and relationships. While maintaining her marriage to Sieber for over 50 years, she conducted numerous affairs with both men and women, often with her husband's knowledge and participation. Paramount publicity departments worked overtime to conceal Dietrich's fluid sexuality and unconventional marriage, instead promoting her as an exotic but traditional European sophisticate. The complex circumstances of Maria's conception created a difficult mother-daughter relationship. Film historian Robert Osborne noted, Maria grew up in a household where traditional boundaries simply didn't exist, creating both remarkable freedom and profound confusion. Director Josef von Sternberg, who worked closely with Dietrich on 7 films, once observed, Marlene refuses to acknowledge normal limitations in any aspect of her life, whether artistic, sexual, or familial. When questioned about conventional morality late in her life, Dietrich famously responded, "In Europe, we never worried about what others thought was proper. We simply asked if it was interesting." This philosophy extended to her most intimate family relationships, creating arrangements that remained shocking even by Hollywood's permissive standards. Ava Gardner, Hollywood's most beautiful, barefoot Contessa, terminated multiple pregnancies during her tumultuous marriage to Frank Sinatra, decisions that haunted her for the rest of her life. MGM publicity departments manufactured stories about Gardner's medical issues preventing pregnancy, while the truth was far more complicated and heartbreaking. Gardner later revealed that Sinatra pressured her to terminate at least 3 pregnancies during their relationship, claiming children would damage both their careers. These traumatic experiences contributed to Gardner's increasing alcohol dependency and her complicated feelings toward Sinatra even decades after their divorce. In private letters, Gardner described unbearable guilt and wondered about the children who might have been. The psychological impact of these decisions was devastating. Director John Ford, who worked with Gardner on Mogambo, recalled finding her sobbing uncontrollably after receiving a gift basket for pregnant co-star Grace Kelly. "Ava told me she'd never be able to celebrate a pregnancy because she'd given up that right," Ford later revealed. When Gardner's autobiography was published posthumously, entire chapters addressing these experiences were removed at the insistence of Sinatra's legal team. Howard Hawks, who directed Gardner in The Land of the Pharaohs, once noted, "Ava carries a sadness no amount of fame or beauty can touch. She's mourning something no one is allowed to mention." The stunning actress whom Ernest Hemingway called the most beautiful woman in the world carried invisible wounds that shaped her self-destructive behavior throughout her legendary career. What's more shocking, these devastating family secrets, or the fact that Hollywood's publicity machine managed to keep them hidden for decades. The Golden Age wasn't just about glamour and fame. It was about carefully constructed lies that protected the industry's most valuable assets. Which of these revelations surprised you most? Did these family tragedies make you view these legendary stars differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below.